In the first year of the Pacific War, the sky belonged to the Mitsubishi A6M0. It was a machine of terrifying elegance. Designed by Jiro Horikoshi, the Zero was a masterpiece of compromise. To achieve range and agility, armor was sacrificed. Self-sealing fuel tanks were omitted. The result was a fighter that felt weightless. It could turn on a dime. It could climb effortlessly. In the hands of the veteran Japanese naval aviators, men who had honed their skills over China, the Zero was invincible. American pilots flying the stubby Grumman F4F Wildcat found themselves in a nightmare. If they tried to turn with a Zero, they died. The Zero would simply loop inside their turn and riddle them with 20mm cannon fire. If they tried to climb away, the Zero would follow them up and shoot them down. The psychological dominance of the Zero was absolute. Japanese pilots developed a swagger. They knew their machine was superior. They mocked the American planes. They called the Wildcat a Grumman Iron Works tub, heavy, slow, and clumsy. They believed that the Americans were incapable of building a fighter that could match the agility of the Zero. This belief was rooted in a cultural arrogance. The Japanese military philosophy valued spirit and maneuverability over brute force. They believed that a samurai sword was superior to a sledgehammer. Through 1942, from Pearl Harbor to the Coral Sea, the Zero ruled the air. It carved a legend across the Pacific. But while the Japanese pilots were celebrating their superiority, a monster was being born in a factory in Connecticut. The Japanese believed that the future of air combat lay in turning fights. They didn't realize that the Americans were building a plane that didn't care about turning. They were building a plane that cared only about speed. The Zero was a dancer. The American answer was going to be a dragster. The Vought F4U Corsair was not designed, it was built around an engine. In 1938, the U.S. Navy issued a request for a new fighter. They wanted speed. Vought engineers looked at the available engines and chose the biggest one in existence, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp. This was an 18-cylinder, 2,000 horsepower beast. It was an engine designed for bombers, not fighters. To harness this power, the Corsair needed a propeller that was over 13 feet wide. This created a massive engineering problem. If the plane had normal wings, the landing gear would have to be incredibly long to keep the huge propeller from hitting the ground. Long landing gear is weak. It snaps on carrier landings. So, the designers did something radical. They bent the wings. They created an inverted gull wing. The wings dipped down from the fuselage, then angled back up. This allowed the landing gear to be short and sturdy, mounted at the lowest point of the bend, while keeping the propeller high off the ground. The result was the most distinctive silhouette of the war. The Corsair looked predatory. It looked like a shark. It was the first American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour in level flight. But it was also huge. The cockpit was set far back behind the massive engine and fuel tank to balance the weight. When a pilot sat in a Corsair on the ground, he couldn't see over the nose. He was blind. The Japanese spies who saw early sketches or reports of this plane were unimpressed. They saw a heavy, complex monster. They saw the bent wings and thought it was an unnecessary complication. They saw the weight, nearly 14,000 pounds fully loaded, compared to the 6,000 pounds, and laughed. It is a brick, they thought. It will never be able to dogfight. They were right. It wasn't a dogfighter. But they failed to understand that in 1943, dogfighting was about to become obsolete. The Corsair wasn't built to dance. It was built to pounce. Before the Corsair could fight the Japanese, it had to fight the US Navy. And for a long time, it looked like the Navy was going to win. The carrier trials for the F4U were a disaster. The plane was simply too powerful and too difficult to see out of. When a pilot approached a carrier deck, the long nose blocked his view of the landing signal officer, LSO. He had to come in on a curve, straightening out at the last second, blindly hoping he was lined up. But the worst problem was the bounce. The landing gear struts were too stiff. When the Corsair hit the deck, it didn't stick, it bounced. It would leap 10 feet into the air, floating over the arrestor wires, and crash into the safety barrier. Or worse, it would torque over and flip on its back. The Navy pilots were terrified of it. They nicknamed it the Ensign Eliminator. They called it the Bent-Wing Widowmaker. Fluid leaked from the hydraulic cowl flaps onto the windshield, blinding the pilot with oil during combat maneuvers. The US Navy decided the plane was unfit for carrier duty. They rejected it. They chose the Grumman F-6F Hellcat instead, a safer, easier plane to fly. The Corsair was banished. It seemed destined to be a footnote in aviation history. A failed experiment in raw power. Japanese intelligence, if they were tracking this, would have felt vindicated. The Americans had tried to build a superplane and failed. Their technology was too clumsy. The Corsair squadrons were kicked off the carriers. But the plane was too fast to scrap. The Navy decided to dump the unwanted Corsairs on the US Marine Corps. The Marines operated from land bases, island airstrips. They didn't need to worry about catching a wire on a pitching deck. So, the rejects were sent to the Solomon Islands. To a place called Guadalcanal. The Marines didn't care about smooth landings. They just wanted something that could catch a zero. And they were about to discover that the Ensign Eliminator was actually the zero killer. Late 1942. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. This was the front line of the Pacific War. It was a mudhole. The Marines here were living in squalor, fighting off malaria, dysentery, and nightly Japanese naval shelling. They were flying tired Wildcats, struggling to hold the line against the Japanese air onslaught. Then, the first Corsairs arrived. VMF-124. The Marines looked at the new planes with suspicion. They were huge. They were strange-looking. But when they fired up the RO-2800 engines, the ground shook. The pilots took them up. They realized immediately that this was a different beast. It climbed like a rocket. It was 50 miles per hour faster than a Zero. The Marines, known for their ability to improvise, adapted to the Corsair's quirks. They learned to handle the blind taxiing by S-turning on the ground. They learned to manage the engine torque. They realized that the rugged construction, which made it heavy, also made it tough. The Corsair could take damage that would disintegrate a Zero. The Japanese pilots operating out of Rabaul began to see these new shapes in the sky. At first, they tried their usual tactics. They tried to lure the Corsairs into a turning fight. But the Marine pilots didn't bite. They used their speed. They dove on the Zeros, fired their 6.50 caliber machine guns, and zoomed back up to altitude. The Zero pilots were shocked. They would see a Corsair diving at them, pull a tight turn to evade, and expect the American to try to follow and stall. Instead, the Corsair would simply blast past them at 400 miles per hour, reposition, and attack again. The Japanese couldn't catch them. The Ensign Eliminator had found its home in the mud of the Solomons. It was ugly, it was difficult, and it was dangerous. Just like a Marine. The Japanese pilots who had scoffed at the heavies American planes were about to learn a lesson in physics. Force equals mass times acceleration. And the Corsair had a lot of mass, and a hell of a lot of acceleration. The Corsair had a weapon that wasn't listed in its technical specifications. Its sound. Japanese pilots and soldiers on the ground began to report a terrifying noise during American attacks. It wasn't the roar of the engine. It was a high-pitched, shrieking whistle. They called the plane Wiki-Ok's whistling death. The sound was an accidental byproduct of the Corsair's design. The massive R2800 engine required enormous amounts of air for cooling and combustion. The air intakes were located in the leading edge of the wing roots, near the fuselage. The oil coolers were also located there. As the Corsair entered a high-speed dive, air rushed over these intakes at hundreds of miles per hour. The air turbulence created by the cooler vents acted like a giant whistle. To a Japanese soldier in a foxhole, the sound was paralyzing. It started as a low moan and rose quickly to a piercing shriek as the plane dove toward them at 400 miles per hour. It was the sound of an unstoppable object. Psychologically, it was devastating. The Zero was a relatively quiet plane. It was graceful. The Corsair was loud, brutish, and screamed as it killed. Japanese pilots began to associate that sound with the sudden disappearance of their wingmen in balls of fire. They knew that when they heard the whistle, a Corsair was coming down out of the sun, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. The Americans loved the name. They embraced it. It added to the mystique of the plane. The reject, the Marine plane, the whistling death. It was an auditory symbol of the shift in the war. The elegant dance of 1942 was over. The screaming industrial slaughter of 1943 had begun. The Corsair was an unconventional plane, and it found its greatest fame with an unconventional unit. VMF 214. The Black Sheep. Their commander was Major Gregory "Pappy" Boyington. Boyington was a hard-drinking, cigar-smoking, bar-brawling rebel. He was also a brilliant fighter pilot. He had flown with the Flying Tigers in China before the war. The Marine Corps had initially rejected him for his behavior, but desperate for experienced leaders, they gave him a command in 1943. He was given a squadron of replacement pilots, misfits and leftovers who hadn't been assigned to other units. They had no planes of their own. They had to borrow Corsairs from other squadrons that were rotating out of the combat zone. They were the black sheep of the Marine Corps. But under Boyington's leadership, they became legends. Boyington understood the Corsair perfectly. He knew it wasn't a dogfighter. He taught his pilots to fight as a team. He taught them the thatch weave, a tactic developed by Navy pilot John Thatch. If a Zero got on a Corsair's tail, another Corsair would cross behind it, forcing the Zero to break off or face a head-on pass. Boyington was aggressive, but also calculating. He used the Corsair's range to penetrate deep into Japanese territory, attacking airfields that the Japanese thought were safe. He would taunt the Japanese over the radio, challenging them to come up and fight. The Japanese pilots, enraged, would take off in their Zeros, only to find the black sheep waiting high above them, ready to boom and zoom. VMF 214 racked up incredible scores. In just 84 days of combat, they destroyed or damaged 203 Japanese planes. Boyington himself became the Marine Corps top ace, with 28 kills, some from his Flying Tiger days. The Black Sheep Squadron proved that the Corsair wasn't just a powerful machine, it was a weapon that rewarded aggressive, intelligent leadership. They were the pirates of the Solomon skies, and the Corsair was their ship. Their success, highly publicized back home, cemented the Corsair's reputation as the premier fighter of the Pacific. The battle between the Corsair and the Zero was a clash of physics. It was energy fighting versus angles fighting. The Zero was an angles fighter. Its low weight and large wing area allowed it to turn tightly. It won fights by creating angles, getting inside the enemy's turn radius to bring its guns to bear. The Corsair was an energy fighter. It was heavy, but it had massive horsepower. Energy in aerial combat comes in two forms: speed, kinetic energy, and altitude, potential energy. A pilot can trade one for the other. You can dive to gain speed, or you can zoom up to gain altitude. The Corsair's advantage was its ability to generate and maintain energy. Its R2800 engine allowed it to climb faster than the Zero. Its weight gave it tremendous momentum in a dive. A Zero pilot tried to lure the Corsair into a slow, turning fight, where energy was bled off. A Corsair pilot refused to play that game. He kept his speed up. He never turned for more than a few seconds. He would dive on a Zero, fire, and then immediately use that speed to zoom back up to altitude. The Zero pilot, watching the Corsair rocket upwards, would try to follow. But the Zero, being light, had less momentum. It would run out of energy quickly. As the Zero stalled, hanging helplessly in the air, the Corsair pilot would wing over at the top of his climb and drop back down for the kill. It was a clinical, mathematical way of fighting. The Japanese pilots, schooled in the art of the dogfight, found it frustrating and dishonorable. They felt the Americans were refusing to fight fair. But the Americans weren't interested in a fair fight. They were interested in winning. They used the Corsair's 2,000 horsepower to dictate the terms of every engagement. The Japanese pilot was always reacting. The American pilot was always acting. The Zero was a leaf blown by the wind, the Corsair was the wind. The heart of the Corsair's dominance was its engine, the Pratt & Whitney RO2800 Double Wasp. It is arguably the greatest piston aircraft engine ever built. It was an air-cooled radial engine with 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows of 9. It displaced 2,800 cubic inches. In 1940, when it was first tested, it produced 2,000 horsepower. At the time, most fighter engines, like the Rolls-Royce Merlin in the Spitfire or the Daimler-Benz in the Bf-109, were producing around 1,000 to 1,200 horsepower. The R2800 was a quantum leap in power. But raw power wasn't its only virtue. It was unbelievably rugged. Its cylinders were made of forged aluminum with steel liners. It had a massive two-stage supercharger that allowed it to perform at high altitudes. It could absorb battle damage that would stop a liquid-cooled engine instantly. A bullet through the cooling jacket of a Merlin engine would drain the coolant, causing the engine to seize in minutes. The AV-2800 had no liquid coolant. Corsairs frequently returned to base with cylinders blown off by 20mm cannon shells, oil spewing everywhere, still running on the remaining 17 cylinders. One Corsair pilot famously flew hundreds of miles back to base with a piston rod sticking out through the cowling. This reliability gave the pilots enormous confidence. They knew their engine wouldn't quit on them over the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. The engine was also designed for growth. As the war progressed, Pratt & Whitney engineers used water injection to boost the power even further. By 1945, late-model R2800s were producing nearly 2,800 horsepower in short bursts. The Zeros engine, the Seiki, topped out at around 1,100 horsepower. It was a race between a scooter and a muscle car. The Japanese engineers, struggling with material shortages and lack of high-octane fuel, could not close the gap. The AV-2800 was the embodiment of American industrial might, complex, powerful, and durable. It was the iron heart of the whistling death. By 1944, the air war in the Pacific had fundamentally changed. The days of the desperate defense were over. The Americans were now on the offensive, pushing up the Solomon Islands chain toward the Japanese fortress of Rabaul. On February 14, 1944, St. Valentine's Day, the Japanese Navy tried to push back. They launched a massive airstrike against the Allied beachhead on Bougainville. It was a force of bombers escorted by the cream of the remaining Zero pilots. They expected to catch the Americans sleeping. Instead, they flew into a meat grinder. Waiting for them were the Corsairs. The resulting battle was so one-sided that it became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. American pilots, flying the improved F4U-1A with a blown bubble canopy for better visibility, tore into the Japanese formation. The difference in performance was now undeniable. The Japanese Zeros tried to turn and fight, but the Corsairs refused to play. They used their superior speed to slash through the Japanese formation, firing short, deadly bursts. The Corsair's 6.50 caliber guns shredded the unarmored Japanese planes. Wings snapped off. Fuel tanks exploded. The sky over Bougainville rained burning aluminum. In the end, the Japanese lost heavily. Some reports claim over 20 Japanese planes were shot down for the loss of negligible American aircraft. It was the end of the Zero as a threat. The Japanese pilots who survived returned to Rabaul shaken. They realized that their aircraft, once the terror of the Pacific, was now obsolete. It was too slow. It was too fragile. And it couldn't dive to escape. The Corsair had asserted total dominance. It wasn't just about the machine, it was about the system. The Corsair pilots were rotated home to train new recruits. The knowledge was passed down. The Japanese pilots were kept at the front until they died. The knowledge died with them. By the time of the massacre, the average American pilot had hundreds of hours of training in the Corsair. The average Japanese pilot was a rookie flying a plane designed in 1939. The slaughter over Bougainville proved that the bent-wing bird was the king of the Solomons. While the Marines were racking up kills from land bases, the U.S. Navy was watching with envy. They realized they had made a mistake. They had rejected the Corsair because it was too hard to land on a carrier. They had settled for the Hellcat, which was a great plane, but slower than the Corsair. But they needed that speed. The solution to the landing problem came from an unlikely source, the British. The Royal Navy Fleet Air Arm had received Corsairs under Lend-Lease. Unlike the Americans, the British didn't have the luxury of rejecting the plane. They needed every fighter they could get. So, they figured out how to land it. The British pilots developed a new approach technique. Instead of a long, straight approach, where the Corsair's long nose blocked the view of the deck, they approached in a continuous, sweeping left-hand turn. By keeping the plane in a bank until the very last second, the pilot could look out the side of the cockpit and keep the landing signal officer, LSO, in view. He would straighten out only at the moment of touchdown. It required nerves of steel and precise timing, but it worked. The British also modified the landing gear struts to reduce the bounce and raised the pilot's seat by a few inches to improve visibility. When the U.S. Navy saw the British operating Corsairs safely from their smaller carriers, they swallowed their pride. They adopted the British technique. In late 1944, the Corsair finally returned to the U.S. fleet. It arrived just in time. The nature of the war was changing again. The Japanese were running out of pilots, so they were turning to suicide tactics. The fleet needed a fast interceptor to stop the kamikazes. The Hellcat was good, but the Corsair was faster. The Ensign Eliminator had finally been tamed. It was no longer an outcast. It was now the premier carrier fighter of the U.S. Navy, ready for the final drive toward Japan. 1945. The Battle of Okinawa. The Japanese Navy had ceased to exist as a fighting force. But the divine wind, the kamikaze, was threatening to bleed the U.S. Navy to death. Hundreds of Japanese planes, piloted by men on a one-way mission, were hurled at the American fleet. The defense of the fleet depended on the Big Blue Blanket, a screen of fighters patrolling constantly over the ships. The Corsair was the star of this defense. Its speed was critical. A kamikaze usually started its run from high altitude, diving at terminal velocity toward a carrier. To stop it, you needed a plane that could catch it in a dive. The Corsair, with its massive R2800 engine and heavy weight, was a diving champion. Corsair pilots would spot a kamikaze, drop their external fuel tanks, and push the throttle to war emergency power. The water injection system would kick in, boosting the engine to nearly 2,800 horsepower. The Corsair would scream down, shaking with speed. The 20mm cannons, fitted on later models like the F4U 1C and F4U 4, would tear the kamikaze apart before it could reach the ships. It was a gruesome task. The American pilots knew they were killing men who wanted to die. They weren't dogfighting, they were executing an interception to save their shipmates. The Corsair's ruggedness was vital here too. Sometimes, the debris from the exploding kamikaze would hit the pursuing Corsair. Corsairs returned to carriers covered in oil, soot, and pieces of Japanese aircraft. One Corsair pilot, trying to stop a kamikaze, ran out of ammunition. He used his propeller to saw the tail off the Japanese plane. he managed to land his battered Corsair safely. The Whistling Death had become the guardian angel of the fleet. It was the only thing standing between the carriers and the suicide divers. The Japanese had mocked the Corsair as a clumsy's plane. But in the skies over Okinawa, its clumsiness, its weight and speed, made it the perfect interceptor for a desperate war. In the final months of the war, the Corsair took on yet another role. Mud fighter. The Marines on Okinawa were fighting a brutal battle against Japanese troops dug into caves and bunkers. They needed close air support. The Corsair, with its massive gull wings, could carry a staggering amount of ordnance. It could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs. It could carry napalm. And it could carry a tiny TIM rockets, massive 11.75-inch rockets that hit like a destroyer shell. The Marines on the ground loved the Corsair. They called it the sweetheart of Okinawa. When they were pinned down by a Japanese pillbox, they would call in the Corsairs. The planes would come in low, scratching the belly on the ridges. They would drop napalm canisters that tumbled end over end, turning the Japanese positions into infernos. The accuracy was incredible. Because the Marines flew the planes, and Marines were on the ground, they spoke the same language. The Corsair was no longer just a fighter, it was flying artillery. By the end of the war, the F4U Corsair had flown 64,051 sorties. It was credited with shooting down 2,140 Japanese aircraft. Its loss rate was incredibly low. The final kill ratio was 11-1. For every Corsair shot down in air-to-air combat, 11 Japanese planes were destroyed. It was a statistic of total dominance. The plane that the Japanese had laughed at, the plane the US Navy had rejected, had become the most capable fighter-bomber of the war. It didn't just win the air war, it helped win the ground war. After the war, while other propeller planes were scrapped for jets, the Corsair soldiered on. It fought in Korea, still proving its worth as a ground attack aircraft. The legacy of the Corsair is written in its silhouette. The bent wings, the long nose, the massive propeller. It remains one of the most recognizable and feared machines ever built. The Japanese admirals had wanted a sword fight. The Corsair brought a gun to the knife fight. And it never missed.